They came while the sky still burned gold with the breath of dawn. Dozens of hoofbeats, not thunderous like a charge, but slow, arrogant like men who already owned the land. Clara Rawlins heard them before she saw them, and by the time she reached her fields, the dust had already swallowed the horizon. Her hands, callous from years of toil, reached the fence too late. Her cattle, the only wealth she had left after her husband died, were driven off by settlers with government flags on their saddles and rifles slung too low, too eager. They didn't ask. They didn't look at her. They just took Dot Clara had never begged before. Not during the drought. Not during her childbirth alone in that broken cabin. But that morning, her knees hit the dirt. Not to pray. Just to catch herself. As everything she built collapsed without a word. The land had never been kind. But it had been honest. The settlers were neither. And behind them, her fence smoldered where someone had struck a torch. It was a message. Not just theft, but a warning. Stay silent or be next. The sheriff didn't answer her knock. When she pounded harder, he glanced out the curtain, then vanished like smoke. At the saloon, the men turned away from her cracked boots and frayed hem. Don't make trouble. One woman whispered. They've got papers. You've got dirt. Clara's rage rose silent like the morning fog. But what could a widow with no cattle do against signed names and polished boots? That night, the wind howled across her empty field. She stood alone beneath the moon, listening to the ghosts of her herd. Every cow had been branded with her late husband's marca pine tree over water. For strength and life, she had burned it onto leather with his own hands. And now, that symbol roamed under another man's flag. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She waited for a sign, for justice, for anything. But justice came not in a courtroom or behind a badge. It came on horseback. 3 days later, a lone figure rode across the hills with no lantern and no flag. He didn't ask questions. He didn't knock. He simply stopped outside Clara's barn and looked at the broken gate, the scorched field, the woman with dirt on her face and hollowness in her eyes. He wore no uniform, just buckskin and silence. But on his belt hung a knife older than any she had seen. The handle was wrapped in sinew and stories, and the way he dismounted carefully, like the ground mattered, said everything. His name would come later. For now, he was just a presence, one that did not ask for hospitality, only permission to listen to the land. That same night, howls echoed across the valley. Not coyotes, but men. One of the sellers who had stolen her cattle was found hogtied in his own barn. A pine branch, nailed above the door, its leaves blood-tipped. A warning. The others laughed it off, until the second man vanished. Then the third. And when their leader's prized stallion was found wandering in the canyon, with his rifle snapped into, they stopped laughing. The Sioux warrior worked in shadows. He left no name, no camp, only symbols. Clara watched from her porch, numb and aching, as fear began to spread not among the weak, but among those who had walked with impunity for too long. And for the first time since that morning, she felt something shift. The land was listening again. But justice doesn't ride in alone. It grows. It echoes. It builds from silence and pain. And soon, others would hear the rhythm of hooves that didn't belong to bandits or soldiers, but to something older, something sacred. Because when the cattle were taken, Clara lost everything. But when the Sioux warrior returned, he would bring not just her herd, but 1,000 more. And with them, the first wind of frontier redemption. If this story gripped your heart like a storm rolling in from the plains, don't scroll past. Stay with it. Because what happens next isn't just vengeance, it's a rebirth. And when frontier redemption takes shape, the land itself remembers. The sheriff finally showed his face when the bodies started piling up, not dead, but humiliated. The third settler was found stripped of his coat, hanging upside down from the windmill outside the very station where Clara once begged for justice. Pinned to his chest was a braid of horsehair and a carving of her husband's cattle brand. The sheriff barked about law and order, but nobody moved because deep down, the town knew what was happening. It wasn't law they feared, it was truth. And truth had finally gotten teeth. Clara stayed quiet. She had no answers. The warrior never came to her porch again, but he left signs of broken spur on her doorstep, a token from one of her stolen cow's halters hanging from her barn post. Bits of justice dropped like breadcrumbs. She'd wake to distant drums, no music, just the rhythm of purpose in the earth. The cattle weren't coming back one by one. They were being reclaimed in her name. A week passed, then two, the valley whispered. At night, Clara saw torches flicker on far-off hills. Not from invaders, but watchers, figures standing still among the rocks. They never approached. They only waited, like the land itself was on trial. Then, word came from Widow Langley's ranch, 15 miles east. Her herd had been found doubled overnight. No one knew how. She'd lost 10 cattle to the same gang last spring. Now there were 20 each branded with a mark she recognized, a pine over water. But it wasn't magic. It was method. The Sioux warrior had a system. He wasn't just stealing cattle back, he was redistributing justice across broken boundaries. Herds grew in places where they had once vanished. Widows began waking to fresh feed sacks at their doors. Newborn calves born under strange moons wore brands they hadn't been given by human hands. And in every case, the same whisper followed: Clara Rawlins. It was her name that rippled through the canyons, her pain that lit the fuse. The settlers grew. Paranoid. Guns appeared in windows. Dogs were tied up along the trails. But no one could stop what had already begun. Their fear wasn't of a man, it was of a movement. And movements don't bleed easily. By the 3rd month, the cattle weren't returning. Alone. Bison herds, long vanished from the region, began moving through forgotten trails, guided by unseen hands. Some said it was just migration. Others swore they saw riders, among them young men painted in ash, driving the ancient giants with staffs wrapped in red thread. The earth was being reminded of its own strength, of what once roamed before fences and treaties. Clara's fields, once bare, were now filled with more life than she could count. Not just cattle, but children helping tend them, orphans, runaways, people the town had forgotten, now following the hoofbeats of the man they called only Stone Horse. That was the name passed from mouth to mouth. No one knew if it was real. It didn't matter. The myth worked harder than a bullet. And the sheriff? He tried once to chase the figure down through the canyon. Rode hard with 6 deputies. Only one returned with his boots missing and his badge folded into the shape of a pine branch. He didn't speak for days. When he did, his voice cracked. It ain't revenge. It's a reckoning. Clara sat on her porch as spring turned, staring at the wide land that had once mocked her grief. Now it trembled under her name. She never asked for vengeance. She wanted peace. But peace, she learned, often rides on the saddle of justice. And when it comes, it doesn't knock at breaks gates. Still, there was more to come. For even now, deep in the sandstone ridges to the north, a plan was forming. One that would not only return cattle or honor, but tear apart the very roots of power in the territory. Because justice, once awakened, doesn't sleep again. The town clerk thought his office was safe. Locked drawers, iron vault, 2 rifles, and a reputation for keeping quiet. But on a windless night, his windows rattled with a force not born of wind. He arrived the next morning to find his records scattered like autumn leaves. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. And on his desk, a single piece of raw hide burned with the image of a pine tree over water. Beneath it, a hand-drawn list. Names of every settler who had claimed cattle in the last year, each marked with either a red slash or a green circle. The townsfolk panicked. Some packed wagons. Others bribed stagecoach drivers to take them east. The ones who stayed did so out of stubborn pride. to convince their fences and money would protect them. But fences meant nothing to the man who rode wind instead of rode. And money had already lost its weight. Clara watched as the lines in town redrew themselves. The church pews emptied. The sheriff resigned, citing spiritual exhaustion. And in his place, a militia of vigilantes rose up, all eager to reclaim order with bullets and threats. But order built on theft was already cracked. They called for Clara's arrest, accusing her of conspiring with outlaws, hiding fugitives, and inciting rebellion. She didn't flinch. When they arrived at her port, they found not fear but neighbors. Dozens of them, farmers, trappers, old women who remembered her husband's kindness during the bad years. They stood with her, silent and unmoving. The vigilantes didn't fire a single shot. And still, the herds grew. Across the hills, smoke signals danced above ridgelines. Men from tribes thought long gone rode into view Kiowa, Arapaho, Lakota each. One guided by stone horse, who had stopped being just a man. He had become a language, a warning, a movement. Where once there were fences, now there were shared pastures. Where once there were brands of ownership, now there were marks of unity, old symbols burned into hide, not to claim possession, but to honor history. The ranchers who had built their empires on stolen land began losing more than cattle. Their ledgers no longer balanced. Traders turned away from their wagons. Even their own ranch hands walked off, some joining the Growing Pine brand caravan that drifted between valleys like a ghost army. It was peaceful, but unstoppable. They planted seeds as they moved, left feed, repaired barns, and where they passed, the wind carried only one phrase: redemption rides with her. Clara had never asked for any of this, but now she stood in it. She walked into the same general store that once refused her credit and paid in coin made from melted settler metals. She wasn't bitter. She was building. One plank, one seed, one cow at a time. She opened her field to the orphans, created a ledger of her own, one that listed needs, not debts. And still, every few nights, she'd find a note pinned to her. Gate with a sliver of raw hide, 3 herds coming through Cedar Fork. Ready your pasture. She did. And they came. Meanwhile, in the government offices downstate, whispers began to rise. Something was wrong in the North Valley. Records didn't match. Landowners were vanishing. Even their representatives, sent to investigate, returned shaken. One described a ceremony he stumbled upon in the woods, tribes dancing around reclaimed cattle while settlers' brands were burned in a sacred fire. It wasn't war, he said. It was resurrection. But not everyone celebrated. One settler, Benjamin Crake, once boasted he took 50 head from Clara's land and buried her husband's brand under 6 feet of dirt. Now, his ranch stood empty. No cows, no workers, just scorched earth and a message carved into his silo. What you bury, the land remembers. And so, the earth continued to whisper her name, Clara Rawlins. A widow once broken now stood as a symbol of relevance. Her hands still bore the dirt of loss, but now they also held the reins of something greater. Because redemption had never been about one woman. It had always waited in the roots, in the mountains, in the bloodlines the settlers tried to erase. And now, with every hoofprint that fell on that soil, the truth rose again. The cattle were just the beginning. The governor's men came not with kindness, but with wagons and writs. A formal task force of federal agents, soldiers, and land commissioners arrived in a cloud of dust, claiming order, balance, and justice, but carrying weapons instead of wisdom. They marched through town with badges shining and boots to clean to no mud. Their mission, to stop the disappearances of cattle, investigate the so-called uprising, and neutralize any threats to landowning settlers. But Clara Rawlins was no longer seen as a widow with grievances. In the capital, they called her the matron of the rebellion. To those who still held the land through ink and muscle, she was the nerve center of something dangerous, a woman who had somehow turned her grief into a wildfire. They didn't understand her. They only feared what her name now moved. They expected a village of lawless outcasts, of painted raiders and dirt-smeared vigilantes. What they found instead were orchards blooming from fields once burned, clinics built where bar fights used to rage, old cabins transformed into schools, where children with no last names now learned their histories again, not just of the frontier, but of the people who walked it long before borders carved it apart. But even progress breeds enemies. The agents issued edicts, demanded control, and threatened arrest. They set up posts on the outskirts and warned Clara not to cross the treaty, lined a new invisible fence meant to shrink the growth of her influence. They believed maps could tame miracles. They were wrong. That night, the wind changed. It carried drums not of celebration, but remembrance. Smoke curled into the air from the northern ridge, where a ceremonial fire burned like a heartbeat. Riders emerged from shadow-mounted figures wrapped in silence. Faces painted not in war colors, but ancestral shades. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, even Crow emissaries, carrying cedar branches as both warning and blessing. And at the center, Stone. Horse stood. He raised no weapons. He spoke no words. But his presence was a message the government never trained for. He held out a pouch made of stitched rawhide, and from it, he poured ashes into the wind. These weren't just burnt embers, they were remains of the broken, brands stolen by settlers, symbols of land taken, names erased, legacies silenced. He turned and vanished into the tree's dot by morning. The treaty line was gone, not crossed erased, not by guns, but by spirit. Every stake had been uprooted, every tent folded. The agents found feathers tied where their markers had been, and hoofprints circling their wagons just enough to scare, not harm. But they got the message. This was not a revolt. It was a restoration. Still, vengeance is an old snake. One of the settler Z from Dalton, rich with land and hired bounty hunters from the city. They were ruthless, trained to track, break, and vanish. Their target, Stone Horse. They followed him into the backlands near Dead Elk Pass. But they did not return. Only their boots were found washed clean, laces tied together, and hung from a branch in the shape of a pine over water. Dalton grew paranoid. He doubled his guards. He tried to bribe Clara's neighbors. He even built a private rail spur to ship cattle faster before they vanished too. But then, his cattle did vanish not to theft, but to silence. They walked out one night, unharmed, like they heard a call greater than fences. Clara found them days later grazing freely among her herd, without a single rope or brand. They had chosen their redemption. And the town, it began to forget the lies it had lived on. Saloon walls now displayed photos of the pine brand. The church held a service where native elders told origin stories instead of sermons. And school children rehearsed a new anthem that didn't start with conquest but with land, water, and the woman who knelt in the dust and refused to disappear. Still, the government hadn't finished its game. They had one final move, a law, a bill to reclaim Clara's land on paper, a technicality, in spirit, a theft disguised as policy. They believed papers would scare her. But this time, she didn't need to speak. Stone Horse would speak for her. And this time, the hills would echo louder than ever before. The land office building stood like a monument to arrogance bricks laid by stolen hands, funded by broken treaties, guarded by men who smiled only when writing names that didn't belong on deeds. For decades, it had sat atop the tallest ridge, in the valley, overlooking every acre as if it owned the sky itself. But on one moonless night, while the valley held its breath, a fire bloomed inside the heart of that building. Not a destructive blaze, but a controlled one. When townspeople awoke the next morning, the structure still stood. But every map, every ledger, every counterfeit deed had turned to ash. What remained were 6 names etched into the stone with a knife. Among them, Clara Rawlins. Panic gripped the settlers. Not from fear of war, but of truth. They had never expected to be held accountable. The federal bill to reclaim Clara's land was signed in the capital the following week, but it arrived too late. By the time the marshals came to enforce it, Clara's land was no longer land. It was territory reborn. It stretched beyond legal borders, tended by thousands of Han Sioux, Cheyenne, black settlers, runaways, farmers, mothers. The law had no jurisdiction over what had become sacred. Stonehorse had not been seen for days. Some believed he had disappeared into the wind, as spirits do once their task is complete. Others whispered he had gone to gather the final circle of riders, the ones who knew how to dissolve the last fence. Because while Clara's cattle had returned and multiplied, and her fields blossomed with life, one last settler still held power. E. from Dalton. He had money. He had Washington's ear. He had land that stretched from the riverbed to the canyon's mouth. And he had vengeance boiling inside him like a kettle left too long. But that power unraveled quietly. The ranch hands he'd paid for loyalty disappeared one by one, some leaving behind notes, others just silence. His ranch, once filled with gunmen and guards, fell eerily still. Cattle refused to graze. Crops grew wild but bore no fruit. The land rejected him, not out of magic but memory. He had built his fortune on Clara's pain, and now, the land. Remember, then came the night of the final fence. It was built in secret 5 miles of iron posts, designed to trap the last free herd and divide the valley once and for all. Dalton believed that if he could control the last open range, he could strangle Clara's dream before it grew too large. But the land had its own defenders. At midnight, under a sky thick with storm clouds, figures moved through the fog. They wore no armor, carried no guns, only rope, fire, and silence. Clara stood among them, not leading, not ordering, but walking in step. Beside her, elders chanted low into the ground, hands pressed to the dirt as if asking permission. Then they began. The fence fell post by post, not torn, but uprooted like weeds. Each stake tossed into fire. Each barbed coil unraveled and turned into loops of hope, crafted into lassos for children to learn from. By dawn, nothing remained, and standing in the clearing was the herd, the 1,000 cattle once stolen, now surrounding Clara like guardians of something older than law. Dalton arrived in a fury, rifle drawn, voice broken from shouting. But the land did not answer him. It stayed still, watching, judging. He raised his weapon at Clara, at the herd, at the future. But the bullet never left the chamber. His horse reared, eyes wild, and threw him backward into the mud. His face hit the dirt, and the pine brand, now stamped into the earth like a seal, stared back at him. He wept, not for loss, but for the truth that he had never been more than a trespasser here. They did not arrest him. They did not beat him. Clara simply turned and walked away. Because true redemption doesn't destroy, it leaves the guilty alone with what they've done. And the town, it watched. Then followed in the weeks that came. The phrase frontier redemption became more than a whisper. It was etched into schoolhouses, painted onto wagons, sewn into shawls. A banner of justice reborn not from blood but from remembering. Still, one final truth waited. A secret buried deep in Clara's land. A truth even she hadn't seen. And when it rose, it would change everything. The cattle roamed freely now, across land that once bore only fences and fear. They walked without limits, symbols of the balance finally restored. Clara stood at the highest ridge, watching the sun melt across the plains like golden syrup. She had given everything she had, not in revenge, but in reclamation. The valley no longer whispered her name, it carried it on the wind like a hymn. But peace has a strange silence, and in that quiet, the past often rises. It happened one evening, as the earth turned amber, and the wildflowers opened beneath the hooves of the 1,000-strong herd. A small calf limped away from the group, down toward the northern gulch, an overgrown hollow few dared to tread. Clara followed, instinct guiding her steps. When she reached the gulch, she didn't find just the calf. She found something buried just beneath the moss and years of untouched dust, a charred wooden beam. Marked faintly with a pine tree overwatered. It was from her old barn, the one that burned the night her husband died. Only she had never known what caused that fire. Her hands trembled as she cleared the brush. Beneath it lay something harder, a slab of stone. And when she dug deeper, she uncovered a graven marked, untended, but deliberate. Buried within were 6 rusted brands, each one bent, melted, and disfigured by flame. The symbols of every settler who had once ruled the region. And laid across them, almost ceremonially, was a necklace woven with buffalo bone and horsehair. She recognized it. It belonged to her husband. He hadn't died in a fire by accident. He had died fighting. A journal, wrapped in wax cloth, had somehow survived. Beside the brands, its pages were cracked and stained, but legible. It was written in her husband's hand. He had uncovered the settler's theft long before anyone else. He had been gathering evidence, documenting every stolen head of cattle, every bribe, every lie sealed with a government stamp. He knew they were coming for him. He had tried to warn the tribe, but the law moved faster than justice. And on the final page, one line stood alone. If I fall, I pray the land remembers. And if it remembers, may the wind return what was taken. Clara collapsed to her knees, the wind tugging gently at her shawl as if answering that prayer. She realized then that Stone Horse had not simply been a warrior. He had been a messenger, a guardian, and perhaps, in some way, her husband's last promise, walking in flesh. Because, in the weeks that followed, Clara learned the truth. Stone Horse was not a stranger. He was her husband's cousin raised among the Sioux. After his own family was erased in a government raid, he had returned not out of rage, but out of duty. Not to avenge a death, but to fulfill a life cut short. The brand they both carried was more than a mark on cattle. It was a bloodline of resistance. And now, with the final truth unearthed, Clara did what she never had the chance to do. She buried her husband properly. On the ridge where the cattle first returned, she laid him to rest beneath a single tree, where the wind always seemed to hum. The townspeople gathered in silence. Even the governor's new delegate, sent to negotiate terms, removed his hat in solemnity, because the land had chosen her, not by vote, not by decree, but by memory. In that moment, frontier redemption was no longer just a movement. It was a place, a legacy, a second chance built not from bullets, but from boots in the soil and truth in the air. Children now learned to read using stories of her courage. Farmers etched her name into plows and seed sacks. And elders told of a woman who knelt in the dirt when all was lost and stood taller than any man. When the land rose with her, Clara's cabin, once barely standing, became a gathering house. Her pastures became sanctuaries, and the pine over water became the valley's emblem not of ownership, but of remembrance. Because after settlers stole her cattle, a Sioux warrior didn't just return 1,000. He returned history. And with it came frontier redemption.